So welcome. We are excited to have this presentation. This is being done in collaboration. This particular webinar series is in collaboration with the Delaware Forest Service, as well as the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control, the Delaware National Estuarine Research Reserve, and I am Jennifer Holmes. I am the Coastal Training Program Coordinator at the Delaware National Estuarine Research Reserve. Welcome, everyone. Just a few reminders for those of you who are new to WebEx. We are using WebEx today, so if you have any issues with audio or visual issues, please feel free to put a text in the chat box, and I'll explain that in just a second to Nicole Marks. But if you want to try and fix those yourself, you can click on the audio and video tab at the top of your screen and adjust any volumes, those kinds of things there. You can also unmute and mute yourself at the microphone icon at the bottom of your screen. We do ask that you stay on mute today, just so that we can reduce any distractions. Also, your video is also at the bottom of the screen, and you can mute and unmute your video there as well. To reduce bandwidth issues, you may want to keep your video off. The chat box is located at the lower right-hand corner of your screen. It looks like a little thought bubble, and it says chat next to it. Feel free to put any questions or comments today. We will be taking questions from the chat box, so feel free to put those in there. Again, if you have technical issues, go ahead and privately chat Nicole Marks, and she'd be able to help you. She just put that message in the chat box. Thank you, Nicole. Again, as a reminder for those of you who are just joining us, this webinar is being recorded and will be available through the Forest Service's YouTube webpage. The National Estuarine Research Reserve System is a network of 29 estuarine areas, places where fresh water from the land mixes with salt water from the sea, established across the nation for long-term research, education, and coastal stewardship. The reserves are a partnership between the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration and the coastal states and territories. NOAA's Office for Coastal Management is responsible for administering the reserve system, and each reserve is managed on a day-to-day basis by a lead state agency or university with input from local partners. Our reserve here in Delaware is managed and funded also by the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. The mission of the reserves is to practice and promote coastal and estuarine stewardship through innovative research and education using a system of protected areas. I wanted to give you a little bit of overview of the NEAR system today because we are glad to have with us Dr. Kauai Winter, the manager of the newest reserve in Hawaii, the Haia National Estuarine Research Reserve. So welcome to all of our friends in Hawaii, and also some folks joining us from around the world in different time zones. So thank you so much for joining us today. We do have our two speakers today, Kyle Harman, who is a member and former council member of the Nanticoke Nation here on the Delmarva Peninsula. And again, Dr. Kauai Winter, the manager of the Haia National Estuarine Research Reserve in Hawaii. At this time, I'm going to hand it over to Keisha Bronskill, who is a member of the Lenape community, as well as the Community Urban and Community Program Director for Delaware Forest Service. So, Keisha.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, my name is Keisha Bronskill. I'm with the Urban and Community Forestry Program with the Delaware Forest Service, and I thank you all for attending this evening, and we're really happy to partner with NEAR on this webinar series. This Forest in the Dynamic World series came about because we wanted to provide information and build awareness around land management in our region. Or Delaware region. So forests, urban forests, coastal, tidal, and non-tidal ecosystems, and making these areas more resilient as we see this influx of change in land use through development or climate impacts. So this is the third installment of this series, and we wanted to include perspectives of the original land managers of this land that we live on here in Delaware and our surrounding area. For your information, for those of you that are not familiar, we have two state-recognized indigenous tribes in Delaware. One is the Lenape Indian Tribe of Delaware, of which I'm a tribal citizen of, and also the Nanticoke Indian Tribe. Our two tribes are closely related, and we're also closely related to the Nanakoke Lenai Lenape tribe of southern New Jersey. Our three tribes together share many of the same core family surnames in our lineage. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Kyle Harman, who is a tribal citizen of the Nanakoke Indian tribe and who will be opening up for us today, and then beginning his presentation on local indigenous community perspective of Delmarva's forest land. Kyle?
Good afternoon, everybody. If you have your cameras on, give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. All right, perfect. So I want to start off by saying Wanishi, which is a Eastern Algonquin word that means hello and also thank you. So, I want to thank you all for sharing this space with me and all the other amazing partners that help put this together. None of this is possible without their hours of hard work and dedication and open-mindedness, which I think is very important. Before we get things started, traditionally us Eastern Chesapeake Algonquin natives have certain things that we do to help create a safe space for each of us. And there's also a protocol that's done before we enter the forest and go on any of our journeys that we would have gone on throughout the year. So I'm going to share a little bit of it with you. Obviously it's not the same because we're not in person, we're not actually in the forest and things like that, but there are certain things that we hold near and dear to us, and I want to share some of that with you all as we go through some of this. So I got some items here that I'm going to discuss and talk about, and then we'll also there's also a thing that we like to say to each other to help create this space, and I'll go through that as well. But the first thing I wanted to talk about was just how we give thanks and how we present our gifts to the forest. So the forest is something that's very sacred to us, and we hold it really near and dear to our hearts. And like I said, we never go in without presenting gifts to it, because in exchange for presenting those gifts to the forest, it allows us to sustain our life. And it keeps us moving, and it keeps our kids and our grandkids able to live the life that our ancestors once lived. So normally, we would have something familiar. This is a gourd, kind of been hollowed out and things. But with this, with you all, I want to show you that this isn't just a take kind of culture. We give, and in exchange, we get things in return. So, in this gourd, I'm going to place seeds from our four sisters. So, I have some corn seeds here that we'll place in this gourd. We also are going to throw some of our beans in here as well. Okay, we also have some squash seeds that we're going to put in here. So those are our three traditional sisters, and we also have a fourth sister that often gets not the same attention as the others, but we also have some sunflowers here as well. So we're going to put these seeds in this gourd, and we have guests from all over the world as well. But we want to make sure we're representing, our Nanticoke lineage, which is, we are known as the Tidewater People. We inhabited much of the region of the Delmarva Peninsula, and all of those coastlines that come with it. So I also have, I don't know if you can see it, but it's an old shell, okay, that we'll place in this gourd. If you can see some of the smoke rising up above, it's because I've lit some of our traditional medicines as well to help clear the space. But I also want to put some green leaf and also some brown leaf tobacco in this gift offering as well, just to allow us, tobacco is a very sacred thing to our people here in this region. And it also, we hold it very near and dear to our hearts and our spirits. So, we place this in there. Also, luckily, I know our doctor isn't able to be with us personally, but I was out in Hawaii a few years ago, and I was able to collect some of these volcanic rocks as well. So, even though he's not able to join us here, we still have a piece of where he is at that we'll put in this board as well. What we would do is we would plant, we would place this in the forest somewhere, and we would go through our protocols in order to make sure we had a safe journey throughout the forest. So, I wanted you all to know that, understand that, these aren't just objects, these aren't just finite, resources for us. They actually have meaning and purpose. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to discuss that. But yeah, so before we go on this journey together, I want to kind of share some words with you. And these are words before words. Okay, so we'll go through this here. But what I want you to do, honestly, folks, is to, just take in, let's use all 5 of our senses. And I want you to really take in the smells that you're incorporating, that you're seeing and hearing right now, and you're smelling. I want you to take a look at your surroundings and what's all around you. I want you to hear the different noises that you would hear in your space. I want you to touch, the certain things that are near and dear to you, because this is very important as we go through this. And we need to come into this space with one mind. We all come from different parts of the world. We all see the world through a different lens, but we need to be able to share this space with one another. So today we have gathered, and as we look upon the faces around us, we see the cycles of life continue. We have been given the duty to live in balance and harmony with each other and with all living things. So now let us bring our minds together as one as we give thoughts and actions to each other as people. We are thankful to our Mother Earth, for she gives us everything that we need for life. She supports our feet as we walk upon her. She gives us joy that she still continues to care for us just as she always has from the beginning of time. To our Mother Earth, we send our love and respect. We give thanks to all the waters of the world for quenching our thirst, for providing strength, and nurturing life for all beings. We know its power in many forms. Waterfalls and rain, mist and streams, rivers and oceans, snow and ice. We are grateful that the waters are still here, meeting their responsibility to the rest of creation. Can we agree that the water is important to our lives? Let's bring our minds together as one to send thoughts and actions to the water. We now turn to the vast fields of our one-legged relatives of the plant world. The berries, the plant foods, the medicines, and all the families of trees. As far as the eye can see, the plants grow, working many wonders, thus sustaining many life forms. With our minds gathered together, we give thanks and look forward to seeing plant life for many generations to come. We gather our minds together to send our thoughts and actions to all the beautiful animal relatives of the world who walk, swim, and fly about with us. They have many things to teach us as people. We are grateful that they continue to share their lives with us and hope that it will always be so. Let us put our minds together as one and send thanks to the animals. We are all thankful for the powers we know as the four winds. We hear their voices in the moving air as they refresh us and purify the air we breathe. They help us to bring the change of seasons from the four directions they come, bringing us messages and giving us strength. With one mind, we send our greetings and thanks to the four winds. Now we turn to where our grandfathers, the thunder beings, live. With lightning and thundering voices, they bring with them the water that renews life. We bring our minds together as one to send thoughts and actions to our grandfathers, the thunder beings. We send greetings and thanks to our oldest brother, the sun. Each day, without fail, he travels the sky from east to west, bringing the light of a new day. He is the source of all fires of life. With one mind, we send our greetings and thanks to our brother, the sun. We put our minds together and give thoughts and actions to our eldest grandmother, the moon, who lights the nighttime sky. She's the leader of women all over the world. She helps the movement of the ocean tides. By changing her face, we measure time. It is the moon who watches over the arrival of children here on Turtle Island. Let us gather our thanks for Grandmother Moon. Together in a pile, layer upon layer of gratitude, and then joyfully fling that pile of thanks high into the night sky. That she will know with one mind, we send our thoughts and actions to our grandmother, the moon. We give thanks to the stars who are spread across the sky like jewelry. We see them at night, helping our grandmother to light the darkness and bring dew to the garden and growing things. When we travel at night, they guide us to keep us on the right path. With our minds gathered as one, we send thoughts and actions to all the stars. We gather our great minds to greet and thank the enlightened relatives who have come to teach us throughout the ages. When we forget how to live in harmony, they remind us of the way we were taught to live as people. With one mind, we send our thoughts and actions to these caring teachers. We now turn our thoughts to the Creator. Oh, Great Spirit, we send greetings and thanks for all the gifts of creation. Everything we need to live a good life is here on Mother Earth. For all the love that is still around us, we gather our minds together as one and send our choicest words of greetings and thanks to the Creator. We have now arrived at a place where we can end our words before other words. Of all the things we have mentioned, it's not our intention to leave anything out. If something was forgotten, we leave it to each individual to send such greetings and thanks in their own way. Now, our minds are one, and with that, I think we can proceed to share this space with one another.
Thank you so much, Kyle, for that opening. We really appreciate that. It was very inspirational. And thank you so much for bringing that to us today. At this time, we're going to be moving into your presentation on, so you're up first in the presentation. So we'll continue on, and I have the tree photographs up and sharing for you as you speak. So.
All right. Well, thank you all again. I have to apologize. We got grass cutters going on, weed whackers going on outside. I have an extremely hypersensitive smoke alarm, so I had to open a window. Number one, I don't like to smudge with the windows closed. That kind of defeats the purpose. But also, I don't want to set that alarm off either. But thank you all for joining us. Like I said, my name is Kyle Harman. I'm a member of the Nanticoke Nation. We are an indigenous people that has been a part of this Delmarva Peninsula for, at least 16,000 years, if not more. When we were talking earlier about how blended our communities are between the Nanticoke, the Lenape, and the Nanticoke, Lenni, Lenape, we really mean that. Our folks, boundaries, we didn't have borders or anything like that. Our waterways or our highways, we got along with a lot of people. That's how we were able to sustain our lifestyle for so long. So the Nanticoke are traditionally known as the Tidewater People because of our close proximity to the tidal waters of the Atlantic Ocean and the Chesapeake Bay. But we were also known as the bridge builders as well. And my interpretation of the bridge builders is that we connected communities. We wanted to bridge together our worlds so that way we can together reap the benefits of this wonderful landscape that is the Delmarva Peninsula. So, it only makes sense that our communities are interblended through marriage and having children with each other. And just like most families are, right? We don't always see things through the same lens. And just like one would not see the same situation as their brother or sister. So I certainly appreciate these moments where we can collaborate and work together to bring about positive change that will impact 7 generations. So, those words that I spoke right there, you talk about our connectivity. I heard Talek Coker use those words before. So with his permission, he allowed me to kind of use that. And again, right, we're bridging together our 2 worlds. Just because we are part of 2 different sovereign indigenous nations doesn't mean that we're not able to collaborate and work together. So I did want to give, Talek Coker his shout out, because without him, I would not be able to share those words with you. So it sounds like we want to have a conversation about the indigenous perspectives on the forest lands and things. So number one, right, I am so excited to be a part of this conversation. I am, like I said, I'm a member of the Nanticoke Nation. My family has been a part of our nation since its inception, not just when we were finally recognized by the state of Delaware, right? Whatever that kind of means, right? We didn't necessarily need their approval to be who we are, but it helps, makes things a little bit easier on our end in terms of how we try to function in our day-to-day operations. But yeah, my great-grandfather was one of our first elected chiefs back in our incorporation in the 1800s. My family has lived in that Sussex County area for hundreds of years, with colonization that's been happening down there. And our connection to the community has stayed strong. There's always been somebody in my family in an administrative role in terms of running our nation. And my turn came up in I want to say 2017, and I served a term as a tribal council member with the Nanticoke, and it was a tremendous experience. Now, I actually live in Columbia, Maryland, so I was making the commute back and forth to try to help support our community the best that I can. I still have a lot of family that lives down there, so at least I had a couch and a bed to sleep on when I was putting in this work and traveling back and forth. I got 3 kids. And they are all very proud of who they are. They're proud of where they come from, and some of this stuff, my conversation evolves around family, right? My grandfather, who I learned most of my characteristics from growing up, born and raised in Delaware, he actually escaped the residential schools system that I'm sure has made mainstream media not as mainstream as we probably wish it would be, but it's starting to come out. So he actually was not able to go to those residential schools, and it probably saved his life. But he was a lumberjack, and he was out in the woods for 45 plus years. So I grew up in the forest. I grew up with him, learning, all the things that he learned throughout his long life of being out in the woods. And it's an interesting perspective from him because he is a person who was clearing the forest, right, and making room for a lot of colonization efforts. But still, he still was grounded in who he was. His character and his values and his beliefs helped him in his business practices. And one thing that he really took pride in was talking about how he would clear a tract, and he said his life's goal was to make sure he was able to go back at some point and recut that same tract, and he was able to do that numerous times throughout his tenure as a lumberjack. But what we're going to talk about here with that is just our relationship, right? So I have a deep relationship with him and the rest of my family, and he taught me this relationship with the woods as well. Okay, so he was the one that told me about the protocols that we have to do when we go into the forest. And he has a whole life bodies of work that speak to the power of these protocols, because 45 years as a lumberjack, I mean, that's one of the most dangerous jobs on the planet. My grandfather was able to navigate that process, and the worst injury that he sustained was losing his teeth. He had a log slide through and come through the glass and knock out his teeth, which he's very lucky to be alive. But to be in that industry for 45 years and to walk out with just losing your teeth, I'd say he was winning in that regards. And a lot of that he credits to his respect to the forest and how that played out. So each day before he went into the woods, he made sure to go through the protocol that was passed down to him from his father, and then those that walked before them. You give thanks, you give gifts, and in exchange, the forest provides you everything that you need to sustain your life. But talking to him and listening to all the many different things that happen throughout his experience and my own in these woods, I come to learn a lot, right? Our forest setup now, from his perspective, from my perspective, and again, I'm coming from a background in education. I'm a school teacher by trade, so I'm not the local expert. I can just speak to the values and the meaning from an Indigenous perspective, which I can claim. But we are in an unhealthy state in terms of the forest. Traditionally, right, when you think about prior to colonization, what our forests look like, I mean, they were vast. They up, especially in this region. That Delmarva Peninsula was entirely wooded outside of the areas that were cleared for our agricultural practices, which is a huge part of our lifestyle. But through these woods, right, they were intentionally set up to allow us to thrive and sustain our way of life. And what I mean by that is, just from the very basic perimeter of where our villages were. So we didn't live in huge metropolitan areas up here in this region. We were more in a cluster kind of family structure setups And we were semi-nomadic. So depending on the time of the year, we lived closer to the Chesapeake Bay or closer to the Atlantic Ocean. And as the winter came about, you kind of want to move away from the water, more inland and things like that. So, that required you to navigate the forest if you weren't able to use the waterways. And our towns, our villages, our housing was set up in these, wooded areas, but it was intentionally set up for us to do well. So what I mean by that, so the scenery, the plants, the trees all around the villages, they were all set up. They were nut-bearing trees. They had bushes that were set up that would provide, different types of berries and fruits for us to enjoy, but not just us, for all the living creatures as well. So, when you come out in the morning and it's time to gather up, things to get going for the day that you're going to sustain, give you the energy to take on today's work. You didn't have to go very far to get those nut-bearing trees and to see those fruit-bearing bushes and things like that. And we had that intentionally set up. If we had to travel through the forest, right, along our paths, we had paths that were put down and beat down and stepped on for thousands of years by our ancestors and our relatives. And as they were going on that path, they made sure that there was a 7 generations thinking going into how they did that. So, if we're traveling miles and miles into the woods, you want to make sure that you're able to sustain your energy as you're going on this journey. So they would intentionally plant, our blueberry bushes and raspberry bushes and things like that that thrived with partial shade and things like that around some of these old growth trees, to help us navigate these paths through the forest. So that was intentionally set up. It was also to help us, in terms of getting food, right? So we're not the only ones that are eating these nuts, these berries, these fruits. All of our 2-legged and 4-legged creatures are taking advantage of these gifts from the forest. So that would help us in sustaining our lifestyle as well, right? We're not having to travel as deep into the forest if we can actually bring some of these relatives to us on these paths. They used fire as a way to manage the landscape, right? So, my perception on how society views fire now in the woods is something of a negative stigma associated with it, right? You hear about these huge wildfires that are happening all across Turtle Island and thousands of acres of woodlands that are going up in smoke and things. But we actually were able to control our burns to make sure that it ended up being a positive interaction with the forest. So again, close by to where our people were, we made sure to clear out a lot of the underlying growth, and we were able to control that with our fire. There is a practice that goes into it. There's also a protocol that goes into before you, start to use fire as a way to enhance growth in the forest. And we would go through that. And, what was really important is that we created our boundaries, right? We set up borders. When you talk about borders and things, we set up areas so that way we could control this fire. So that way it didn't go rampant and engulf the entire region. So we were able to use that to our advantage, and close to our villages, they were cleared out, right? So you had those nut-bearing trees, you had these berry bushes and all these fruits that are at our disposal. And then, that fire helped maintain that. It helped make those trees hardier, right? To the point where actually some of our hardwoods were fire resistant, believe that or not, right? Nobody really thinks about a tree being fire resistant. But if you expose that tree to that environment over time, over and over again, it starts to build up that resistance, just like our human bodies are able to build up resistance. When I'm a phys ed teacher, so I think about strength training and things like that, right? You shock the body first, but then it starts to adapt, and then you get stronger and you become more resilient. So our relatives out in the forest, the same way it was utilized. And we had sustainable practices, right? So we weren't, we were practicing different, using our burning to do different segments of the forest. We didn't do it all at once. So, my grandfather, he liked to use an 8-year time period in terms of how he turned over different sets of the land, because you wanted that regrowth as well, right? Because through that fire stimulates new growth, and you wanted that, particularly in areas where people were residing, because again, right, that some of that new growth that comes in, some of that brush that develops, those briars and things like that, it's the home to many of our relatives, our 2- and 4-legged relatives as well. So in addition to the birds and things, so you wanted that stuff to regrow, so you would have an opportunity to sustain your life. We understood that the trees and the plants and the bushes, they all work together. There was a balance within each other, right? I think science has taught us, and we've been telling this story for thousands of years, but science is finally coming up to it, that the trees communicate with each other. And they're able to send nutrients to each other if one's in stress and needing support. So we knew that balance, and we respected it, and we made sure that we honored that the best way that we could. So, our forests look much different today than what they traditionally would look like. When colonization happened, we tried to tell our, folks that came over that, hey, there's a responsible way to go about this. We can sustain your life and at the same time sustaining the life of all of our relatives in the forest. But I'm assuming the message got lost from translation, and they didn't quite understand what we were saying and how we were saying it and how to do it, and it didn't happen. And now we're in the state that we're in now, where we have a lot of, my perception is most of our forests are garbage. They're dirty right now. They need cleansing. They've been out of touch to the traditional sense of how we take care of our forest, and they need some of that traditional practices to get back in place in order for us to sustain our life form moving forward. We try to tell folks to not take the green wood, and that there's plenty of dead wood roaming around, that we could take that, we could process that, and we can use that to our advantage. Again, the message got lost. And now we are clear cutting all kinds of greenwood forests and old growth forests to make way for human life without considering our other relatives that are impacted by deforestation and things. So the one thing I want you to understand, and I hope you can feel it in my voice, is that we're all in this together. Right? This isn't us versus them. This isn't humans versus everything else, right? We got to find our balance. We got to find a way to work together. Just like my Nanticoke folks were bridge builders in terms of getting us to a state where we can live amongst each other, not necessarily see eye to eye, but having that respect for each other and having a protocol put in place to honor one another, even when we don't see things through the same lens. So that's kind of what we want here, right? I think we will never be able to go back to pre-colonization, but what we can do is begin to collaborate and partner and work together. I think Indigenous people, particularly in this area, have the knowledge to help individual landowners. I think they have the knowledge to help big organizations. I think they have the knowledge to help our state parks and federal national parks and things like that, to help us care for this land better than what it's been taken care of in years past. And I hope that with our next presenter, that you get a little bit more of that blueprint and share some of his success stories in the world that he's been able to impact in a positive way. I'm happy to answer some questions if there's some that popped up. But again, I didn't want to share a big, huge presentation or anything. I'm so happy to be here and have a voice at a table to my knowledge has never had a voice before. I'm so thankful that I'm able to share this space with you all. And I'm actually looking forward to learning as well with our next presenter. But yeah, like I said, I'm happy to take some questions if it's there. But, I'm here as a local Indigenous person, giving my personal opinion on how we can do better and what things look like prior to colonization. So thank Wanishi to everyone, and I'm happy to take some questions if they are, or we can just move on.
Thank you so much, Kyle. I know I learned a lot, and I really appreciate your presentation and the opening. For those of you who might have some questions for Kyle, feel free to put those in the chat box. We're going to be taking those questions, and if you don't have them right now and might think of some later, we will also pose those again. But I really appreciate your perspective and telling us a little bit more about the sustainability. I think that's a really important point, and greatly appreciate that. And also hearing about your grandfather as a lumberjack and that connection to the trees in a different way as well. That was really interesting. And thank you so much. And we're going to go ahead and listen and hear from Dr. Kauai Winter. And if you have questions for Kyle and Dr. Winter as we go along, again, feel free to put those in the chat box. And it's my pleasure. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I know Dr. Winter has additional slides for you today. So I contacted Kauai a little while ago, and also in Kyle, and being connected to both of these gentlemen have been very inspirational. And like I said, I've learned a lot, and I really appreciate both of their time in teaching me. And so I was reading in one of Kauai's articles that he recently wrote and talking about Indigenous resource management and co-adaptive management, and contacted him and wanted to learn more about what they're doing in the Haiea Reserve in Hawaii, and thought he could give us an additional perspective from what they're doing in Hawaii and how that might relate to the experience that Kyle has brought forth to us today from a local perspective. So at this time, Kauai, feel free to share your screen and welcome. We're so glad to have you today.
Greetings to everybody from Hawaii. Just give me a moment while I share my screen. Okay, you guys can all see that fine? Okay, for those of you who are paying close attention to the agenda, the topic I'm speaking of is slightly different than what was advertised, although I will touch on that. I'm really going to be sharing with you some perspectives on the role that forests play within indigenous social ecological systems with examples from Hawaii. So I am a professor of biocultural ecology, so I use a lot of more kind of emerging terms. So you'll hear me say things about biocultural relationships or biocultural conservation. Biocultural is a term that recognizes the interconnectedness of humanity and nature, and social ecological systems is a term that we use to describe systems that encompass humanity within it, humans and nature all in one system. So thank you to Kyle for everything you're sharing, opening up the space in the way that you did. I see a lot of similarities between the ways that Indigenous people think on Turtle Island and the ways that Indigenous people think in Pacific Islands that I'll be sharing about. For us, our Hawaiian culture is very much give before you take relationship as well. Before we enter the forest, we have similar protocols. Before we enter the ocean, similar protocols. Before we enter a neighboring community, we have the similar protocols. It's always about recognizing that you are entering a place that belongs to others, and you enter it with gifts in a gesture of gratitude. I will be sharing specifically about two communities that I'm very familiar with, have lived in and worked in for most of my life. So one of them is on Ha'ena, Kauai. I'm currently on vacation right now, so that's the island I'm on, back on Kauai, enjoying time with my family. But the place I work is the place on the right, Heia on Oahu, where we have the National Ash Terrain Research Reserve. So just a little bit about Hawaii, because you guys are all on the continent or Turtle Island. If you are on the east coast of Turtle Island, you are 6,000 miles away from Hawaii, and perhaps some of you, or many of you, or most of you, or if not all, well, Kyle's been to Hawaii. I'm not sure how many people on here have also been to Hawaii, but just a brief history of migrations, human migrations that brought people into Pacific Islands, which we collectively refer to as Oceania. But starting about 3,000 years ago, and all of the dates on this image are debatable, highly debatable, and debate continues based on archaeological evidence and whatnot. But human migrations into the Pacific, conservatively, we could say began about 3,000 years ago. And our ancestors used tools, skills, knowledge, and technologies associated with oceanic wayfinding, which is celestial navigation using the stars and understanding the movement of the stars and the movement of the ocean and the winds and the birds and the moon and whatnot, and using double-hulled voyaging canoes to travel across the largest ocean on the face of the planet. And about 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years before Europeans navigated out of Europe, Pacific Islanders had already found the most remote landmasses on the face of the planet with these technologies. And our ancestors reached Hawaii, and this is a conservative estimate, about 900 AD. One of the last places to be settled on the planet by humanity. And that is Hawaii right there, for those of you who don't know where Hawaii is in the Pacific. It's at the northern tip of what we refer to as a Polynesian Triangle, with Rapa Nui or Easter Island down there in the right-hand corner, and Aotearoa or New Zealand in the left-hand corner. So that's some context for where we are in the world. We have a proverb in Hawaii, Nana Ikikumu, which means look to the source. And so before I move forward and speak of these things, I do need to acknowledge the elders and my teachers who have taught me much of what I know that I'm sharing today. All of these elders have now passed on, but I remain one of the people who carries on their teachings. So I'm going to be talking a lot about Hawaiian conceptualizations of community. So there is a Hawaiian word for this, ahupua'a. Don't worry, that will not be on the quiz at the end of the presentation. But in this indigenous conceptualization of community, our communities did not end at the edge of where the houses were. Our communities extended into the forest, our communities extended into the mountains. Our communities included the forest, it included the streams, it included the nearshore reefs. And so you can see in this Hawaiian conceptualization of community, everything is together. And I'm going to be focusing on the relationships between people and forest today, but that doesn't mean that our relationship with the reefs or the streams is any less significant. I just don't have time to talk about that today. One of the things that we've been talking a lot about recently is how forests are critical cultural habitat for Native Hawaiians, and I'm sure the same is true for Indigenous people all over the world, and the same is true for Kyle's people and Keisha's people as well. It's really the foundation of our material culture. So the plants that we use for lei making, which you can see as an image on the left, our lei are adornments of plant materials that are ceremonial and ritual and gestures of love. And there are many different forms of lei for many different occasions, and the vast majority of those materials comes from the forest. And then picture on the bottom right is a very old picture of a Hawaiian man with a surfboard. So surfing was invented in Hawaii, and one of the reasons why surfing was invented in Hawaii is because we were managing our system so well that we had a lot of free time. Our people were fed, our people were quite often at peace, sometimes at war, but in those times of extended peace, we were able to delve deep into our creative arts and invent new art forms and new sports and things like that. And surfing is one of them that has now been embraced around the world. But I often talk about surfing is really a demonstration of how well we tended our forests, because if we didn't have forests, we wouldn't have been able to make surfboards or make canoes or things like that. Deforestation has been a big issue in Hawaii and happened a lot in the 1800s. when steamships and steam engines on trains were prevalent in Hawaii, and it's at that time when there was massive deforestation. Although scholars in the 20th century blamed that deforestation on the first Hawaiians, the reality is that it happened a lot in the 18th century during the process of colonization. So I am a researcher and a professor, and we do try to explore we use ecological theory to explore the ecological foundations of indigenous resource management. I'm going to be sharing just a little bit about this today, but this isn't a scientific talk, so I'm not going to be going too deeply. But if any of you wanted to look more deeply at this, you can look up these papers. And ultimately, like Kyle, we see ourselves in the positions that we're in now as bridge builders. And we're building bridges between indigenous knowledge systems and conventional knowledge systems. And the role that I have specifically is trying to use science as a tool to translate between indigenous knowledge systems and policymaking. So a lot of the work that I have to do, or a lot that I'm going to be talking about today, is talking about indigenous science. And indigenous science, when I was, 20 years ago when I was in graduate school, we would talk about indigenous science and people would literally laugh at us. We'd be in a room full of scientists and we would hear laughter if we uttered that term. But collectively, a bunch of us have been working on this in Hawaii and around the world, to be quite honest. And we got to a point where maybe about 10 years ago, indigenous science started to be recognized as something that's actually a thing, but in many ways, it was still considered inferior to conventional science. Oh, quick side note, I do not use the term Western because it's a Eurocentric term and America is to our east, which is our colonizer. So I use the term conventional in place of that. But anyway, getting back to indigenous science, I think we've now gotten to a point because of our collective work in this realm where indigenous science is being recognized as not equal, lesser than, greater than conventional science, but just the flip side of the coin. And many of us believe that we need both forms of science to interpret and find the truth, both in terms of problems and the solutions, the problems we face and the solutions to them. So I am fortunate in my career to collaborate with some world-renowned ecologists, but the best ecologist I know is this man, Mac Poi Poi from the island of Molokai, who I'm sure only has a high school education, if that, but he's been recognized internationally. He was a Equator Prize recipient in 2019 at the United Nations for his work in Hawaii and helping us to understand indigenous science. So just to go a little bit more deeply, there are many lenses of life sciences that are foundational to indigenous ecological knowledge, and these are the realms that we're exploring right now as we're trying to understand and describe indigenous science, but things like taxonomy and classification, reproductive biology, species connectivity, species abundance, species richness. These are all things that biologists and ecologists strive to understand. The same is true with our indigenous scientists. They also have been endeavoring to understand these things, and all of this is really the foundation of the indigenous resource management system that I conduct research in. So biocultural diversity, again, is the relationships between humanity and nature. And this is just looking narrowly at the things that were, the named things that were considered food resources. So we have freshwater vertebrates, freshwater invertebrates, ocean vertebrates, ocean invertebrates, macroalgae, birds. These are all native species that have been named, described, and incorporated into indigenous knowledge systems and indigenous resource management. But kind of relating back to the forest, so if this is a schematic representation of how our communities were divided up on the island, so our islands are roughly circles, right? And so we have these larger pie-shaped pieces that are, we refer to as moku, but those are really regions within the island, and each region is divided up into a community or an ahupua'a, that word I taught you guys before. And within each ahupua'a, there were various realms or zones, social ecological zones, and many of those were forested zones that were named and recognized and protected, recognized for their intrinsic value and protected. And each ahupua'a, so the thing about ahupua'a or Hawaiian communities is that you're only allowed to take resources from your own community. You're only allowed to take resources from your own reef, from your own stream, from your own forest. And being that forest is a foundation of our material culture, you had to protect your forest if you wanted to maintain your lifestyle and your culture. But things work in the horizontal, so things were managed vertically and horizontally in the system of resource management. So when we see this modeled onto a landscape scale, we see that the management of connectivity of biodiversity was happening at the Moku scale. So within each region, there are different species assemblages and biological communities that were managed across the whole area. But within one community, happening on a vertical, going from the mountains down to the sea, we were managing water, nutrients, and sediment. So these are some of the social ecological zones. These are the Hawaiian terms for them. And I will describe a few of them. And they're different on each island. These are the ones for the island of Kauai that I'm currently on. But each social ecological zone dictated both appropriate and inappropriate practices. They tended to exist on an elevational gradient because our islands go from mountain to sea relatively quickly. They're very closely correlated with ecological zones that ecologists look at. And there were 5 identified for the island of Kauai, where I am at right now. So the first zone, at the low elevations on older islands such as the one I'm on, it's called the Waukanaka, which is a habitation zone. And this is the areas where we have agroecology and aquaculture and recreation and worship, obviously the place where people are living. You know, the way that we grow food, we don't call it agriculture, because agriculture, you tend to take a habitat, a pre-existing habitat, destroy it, and then grow monoculture of something. That's not the way we did things. Our ancestors did things in Hawaii. We tended to maintain habitats, maintain the habitat integrity, although augmenting it a little bit with some new species so that it could produce food. So wetlands, we kept as wetlands, but we had them wetlands that produce food. Forests, we kept forests, but made them forests that produce food. I don't have time to get into the details of that, but that was all something that happened in this habitation zone at the low elevations. And then moving up, you had several different forest type zones. The first forest type zone was a lowland forest that the intention was to maximize the biodiversity. So in Hawaii, we have the big box stores like Home Depot and Lowe's, and you know, we all go there several times during the course of the year. We're not going to go there every day or necessarily every week, but if we need something, then that's where we go to get it. But in the old days, before there were stores or anything like that, this Waula'au or this timber forest zone, that's where we would go to get our resources for construction or medicine or anything like that. And it was a highly tended forest, one that people were in all the time. But it's where you get your food trees and your fuel trees, hardwood trees, construction supplies, medicine dyes, and various kinds of ceremonial materials. And then moving up in elevation, we get to our Waunahele, our remote forest zone, which is really inconvenient to access because it's in the very steep, higher elevation areas. It was maintained primarily as a native plant community, minimally augmented. It's primarily the bird catching zone. So one of the art forms that our ancestors practiced was this amazing feather work, and this was the zone to capture the forest birds in. And then moving up in elevation, we get into the wet forest, the forest that's perpetually saturated, but yet below the clouds. The upland rainforest is highly inconvenient to access, so people barely ever went up there. It's really cold and wet. You really wouldn't want to spend too much time there unless you're just traversing through to get somewhere else. And it was very minimally augmented. But then in the higher elevations where we have our montane cloud forests, that's called the Wau'aku, or the sacred forest. That is the realm of the gods. And in our conceptualization of cosmology, everything, the islands, we're in a long genealogical chain with Sky Father and Earth Mother creating islands, and then from islands, all of the diversity on islands was born, and then at the very end of the genealogy, humans are born. And so in that sense, everything in that cosmology that was born before us is termed Akua, which has been translated as God, but yet it's very different than the notion of God in a conventional sense. It's a more of an indigenous ancestral deification process. But within the montane cloud forest, our core watershed was protected and maintained as a refugia for these akua, for all the beings that were before us. And not every ahupua'a had a wauakua, but many of them did. And these areas were kapu, or you weren't allowed to access them for any reason. And you weren't allowed to touch them. You weren't allowed to change the biodiversity. They had to be maintained for their intrinsic value. So those are some of the manners in which our relationships with forests existed, but then kind of circling back to the relationship between forests and our whole agroecology system. This is a picture from 1928 of the community of Heia where I'm working. And so all of those forest types are in this image are kind of condensed down into A, but then this is getting back to how forests are nutrient cycling. And, every time there's rain, there's going to be shedding of sediment and nutrients, which come down into our wetland agroecosystems, which corresponds to here. And the wetland agroecosystems are catching the sediment and acting as sediment retention basins that are growing food. This is our taro plant growing here. But whenever you have intensified food production, you're going to have nutrient runoff, which I know happens in the Chesapeake Bay quite a lot. But our ancestors invented various forms of aquaculture, which this is one 88-acre, 800-year-old fish pond aquaculture system that captured the nutrients and turned blooms of diatoms into an amazing biomass of fish. And then the water flowing out into the coral reefs was fine and didn't affect the coral reef ecology. So forests did play a really important role in that whole system. But life isn't like that nowadays. So a lot of the work that's happening here in Hawaii, we term biocultural restoration. So we're restoring those relationships. We're restoring the function of the forest. We're restoring the function of our wetlands. We're restoring the function of our aquaculture systems, and we're restoring, hopefully, the health of our community. The problems that we have in Hawaii are no different than the problems of any other community. We have substance abuse, we have domestic violence, all of these things. We don't see those as separate from nature being out of balance and things being unkempt in the forest and nobody's taking care of the streams. It's all the same problem. So biocultural restoration is the notion that all of these problems are interrelated, and as we endeavor to heal the relationship between humanity and nature, we can solve all of these problems all at once. So that just brings me to my work as a reserve manager for the Heia National Estuarine Research Reserve. So as Jen shared, there are 29 and we are the newest. So just a brief little bit about us. We have a relatively small reserve. We're only almost 1,400 acres. We have multiple habitats. We have coral reefs, we have estuaries, we have coastal forests, we have wetlands, we have streams. But this is the first reserve that was really actually called for by the indigenous and local community of the place. It was not a federal edict coming down from the top. This is something that the community wanted as a way to bring in federal resources to support the biocultural restoration efforts that were happening in the area. There are 7 co-management partners that are mostly, they're state, university, and NOAA is a federal agency, but there are Native Hawaiian and community-based organizations that are also partners, and we are administered through the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, which is a part of the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and that is where I am a professor. But really, ultimately, as a National Estuarine Research Reserve, we are designed to be following the footsteps of our elders, honoring the knowledge and wisdom and life experiences of them, and through our policies, practices, and our work. So part of our goal is to support community-led restoration efforts using indigenous resource management practices. So, which is different because a lot of the other reserves are more conventional conservation with the notion that the humans are the problem. And so if we're going to fix things, you gotta get rid of the people kind of notion. And that's not like that in all reserves, but I think that is a founding philosophy of many of them. So we're starting out with an entirely different philosophy, is we're not labeling people as a problem. We're recognizing that humanity is a solution, and we're endeavoring to engage in biocultural restoration to heal those severed relationships. But we are focused on research. So we do have an overarching research question, and that is, what effect does a revival of indigenous resource management practices have on ecosystem services? So I could talk about that forever, but I won't. Happy to answer questions about it. But with that, I will say mahalo, which is our word for thank you. And we do believe that with all the gloom and doom of what you see in the news and popular media about climate change and the world's going to hell, we actually see very viable solutions for supporting large populations of humans in the Anthropocene. And so again, we're trying to use science to translate what we know to be in Hawaii, what we know to be possible into ways that policymakers can understand. And then if we can scale those up, hopefully we can be a model of how we could possibly save the world. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Kuika. Really appreciate that, and I have appreciated your work. And like I said, really enjoyed reading some of the papers that you've mentioned today. So folks, if you are interested in asking a question, please feel free to put those in the chat box. I see that Chris had asked a question earlier and Kyle answered that. So thank you so much, Kyle, for that question. I will reiterate that and then ask a question to Kuika. Chris had asked, for those of you who may not have access to the chat box, he was talking about the Thompson Island on Rehoboth Bay, and said that he learned that Thompson Island on Rehoboth Bay had lots of dogs buried with people, and the remains were from many hundreds of years ago. He asked if Kyle could talk about your people's relationship with dogs, and Kyle had responded to that, that pets were also considered relatives. And when one human transitioned in the spirit world, our families would also allow our pets to transition into the spirit world with us to help along the journey. And also mentioned that it's now a custom that might be frowned upon from modern day society, but it was common practice with our Eastern Woodland Algonquin communities. So, and I see also, Chris, that you had a follow-up question about the sports and the connection, the relationship between sports, community, environmental restoration. Kyle, I didn't know if you wanted to speak to that, but I also noticed that Kuika mentioned that when talking about surfing as well. And
yeah, now I'm happy to kind of give my perception on it. But yeah, it just, and I probably didn't do a good job of explaining. Like I never like talking about myself because I try to put things above what I do individually. But yeah, I coach basketball. I've been coaching. It's kind of like one of my passions. I've been coaching basketball for 15 years now. I feel old saying it, but since I finished playing. But yeah, I think sport, community, environmental restoration, they all fall in hand. And I say this because, with sports, a lot of people enjoy the artistry that comes along with being an athlete. And being an athlete, especially playing at a high level, puts you in a position where, people are willing to give you a platform to express your voice. So I feel like, our athletes, particularly our Indigenous athletes, need to use that platform to help speak things into existence where most of those conversations that evolve around the sport or the athletes don't involve community and environmental restoration, right? So it's important that our young people understand that relationship between the land, the water, the people, and all the other relatives that coexist in this world, and how we can all do better. I think I worked at a private school in Baltimore City, that took a lot of pride in putting in turf fields. So, they really wanted to upgrade their facilities. They really wanted to make sure that they were able to compete with other private schools in the area, but not thinking about the impact those little black rubber beads have on the local streams and the rivers that flow through that neighborhood. And I would take kids on a walk, and we would see millions of these black rubber beads showing up in the waterways and things. And yeah, it looks great. It sells. It gets people excited about those sports that play on that turf. But at the same time, you know, we are devastating our local ecosystem. So I think it's important to raise awareness. I think athletes have a responsibility, particularly Indigenous athletes, to make sure that we're, you know, carrying the burden of our ancestors to make sure that, you know, we're having these conversations where traditionally they weren't being had with our folks. So I hope that was able to speak to that a little bit better.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I had some Ojibwe friends visiting me last week, and they were telling me about, I forget what the Algonquin word for lacrosse is, but basically, my friend, he was making lacrosse sticks made out of ash wood, which apparently is under threat right now by some invasive borer. He's trying to make as much now with the dead and dying wood to keep that alive and teach some other people how to do that. So there's another interface there. But I'm not the best person to speak about that, but it came to mind when the question came up.
But what a great connection. Thank you for sharing. We have a question in the chat box for both of you. So it says, how can non-Indigenous people, and this person said, like me, support these efforts while still respecting the Indigenous cultures? Wiki, you want to start?
Sure. That's a really great question, and one that I get a lot. I'm sure Kyle does too. It's a fine line between cultural appropriation and respecting and honoring, and it's not always the brightest line. So I think ultimately, you know, this topic came up recently because I think Indigenous Peoples Day was just a little while ago, and somebody was talking to me. I think they're a student at Yale, and it was one of my graduate students, and they were at Yale, and they were talking to me about what people were doing for Indigenous Peoples Day, and it was all these crazy things and I was just thinking, wow, you know, I think the best way that people could celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, because if you just look at what indigeneity is, some of our Indigenous philosophers here in Hawaii talk about the concept of indigeneity quite a bit. And it's, you know, it isn't our intention to otherize when we use that term. So if we can extract the notion of race out of indigeneity, what indigeneity really is longevity in and relationship to place. And so when opportunities come up to honor Indigenous thinking and Indigenous ways of life, it's a chance that you yourself, no matter what your heritage is, can really just take time to develop deep relationship to place. And I think that's challenging if you're coming from a culture that views nature as separate from humanity. You know, we're taught that in institutional education that nature is something separate from humanity, and there is a thing called wilderness, and there is a thing called wildlife that we are not related to. That's not the way we think. And so if, you know, you can take moments to try to break down those social constructs that we've all been taught in institutionalized education and develop a relationship with your place, whether it's your forest or your stream, or if you're in an urban area with the tree outside on the corner or something, just find time to connect. And that's probably the best way that you can honor. And I think maybe also recognizing that the arbitrary line that some cultures divide between humanity and nature is not supported by science, and it's not the worldview that we share. And so even, especially in conservation, not imposing those colonial social constructs upon us as we endeavor to engage in conservation and restoration, as we endeavor to heal the severed relationships between our people and our families and our communities and the forest and the streams and the ocean. You know, it might be a different approach or a different way of thinking than some of you were brought up to believe, but I think just acknowledging that that's our belief. And yeah, I think that would be a good place to start. I hope that helped to answer your question.
Yeah, it's hard. I don't even want to follow up after that because that was a knowledge bomb right there. So thanks, Doc, for that. Um, I I hear that a lot, and I'm actually glad that you know Doc actually spoke about it. Um, you know, it's not a racial thing. I'm so glad that, and I particularly when I'm speaking about, like our Eastern woodland indigenous communities, right? I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but you know, John Smith wasn't the first person to come over the Atlantic Ocean, right? There's evidence and proof that Africans sailed over thousands of years prior to the Europeans and things, um, and there was a way to coexist. There was a way to share space with each other and blend those communities together, and you see that coexistence because there are elements of our culture that have shown up across the water, just like there's evidence of their culture showing up on our end. And the funny thing about that is that a lot of our eastern woodland native people are now looked down upon for that. I like to call it cross pollination of cultures. We're not seen as authentic as some of our other relatives from different regions of Turtle Island. Um, but no, I think it's great to want to support indigenous cultures. I think it's great to want to, make sure you're doing it respectfully and responsibly. Here's something that I've been sharing with people all the time, right? Folks have, a lot of us, our goal in life in this modern society is to try to acquire some sort of property so we can, that pursuit of, what they say, was it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and things like that. So property comes into that. Making sure you're responsible with that property once you're able to acquire that, right? Making sure if you have woodlands that you're being respectful of those forests and making sure you're being responsible in how you take care of that, right? So, trying to help eliminate some of these invasive species of plants of our one-legged relatives is important, and trying to make sure we can incorporate more traditional plants that were there. Learning to support yourselves, right? So not having to go to these mega grocery stores for subsistence, learning how to be able to sustain your own needs right there on your property helps, growing your own vegetables and fruits and things of that nature. But, when I'm thinking grand scheme, 7 generation stuff, right? So in my family and my culture, right, we worked hard to buy our land. And then as that landowner transitions into the spirit world, that property is left to his family, however they see fit. That's something to think about, right? If you really want to make a positive impact, right? Let's just say, hypothetically, you have 7 acres of land in Delaware or wherever you're at. Doesn't have to be the whole thing, but think about that, right? You want somebody, if you're into environmentalism, you're into activism, you're into indigenous people, then why not put something in paper that allows the indigenous people of that region to help take care of that land, or to help show you what you need to do to be living in better relations with all those around us. That could go a long way. A lot of our communities, particularly on this region of Turtle Island, we don't have a lot of space anymore that is collectively our nations. So, we're always looking for that, but it's not about, you own it, we own it, whatever. We want to see things develop in a more traditional sense. And we're happy to work with private landowners. We're happy to work with state and federal organizations to help come up with an action plan to make sure that we're all in a better position moving forward for our kids. Because I don't do this for me. I do it for my grandkids and my great grandkids who are going to inherit, this land long after I turn into dust. So I need to put things in place for them. I need to make sure that the water is clean for them. I need to make sure that they can still, practice our traditional means of subsistence, like hunting and fishing and farming and things like that. And the way that it's going, particularly in my home of Sussex County, Delaware, the industrialization and the commercialization and the housing development are basically wiping out all of that traditional life ways that we are used to the point where, you know, we're not even able to travel through some of these woods unless we own it because they're owned by these communities. And, you know, there's paths and things for people to enjoy nature with these amenities for these communities, but we're walking on the side of the road with no lights in the middle of the night. And, you know, we have to navigate these forests and make sure that we're not on private property because we don't want to get, you know, have violence put against us for that. So, you know, those are things that will really go a long way in sustaining our way of life and paying respects to our folks, right? It doesn't have to be a financial thing. It could be something, hey, I'm going to when I transition, some of this goes to our indigenous people, or, you know, I think one thing that I brought up to our organization when we were having these conversations, right? Uh, I don't know, let's say 100-year lease on this stretch of property. That way your family still owns it, but yet we show you how to take care of it for, you know, and that'll last 4 generations right there. So those are things to keep in mind as we're, you know, having these conversations when I think big picture, right? I don't want you to donate $1 million to my nation. I want you to make this a better world for your grandkids, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Kyle. Yeah, I was going to ask that because I get that question a lot. How can state and local governments help engage in the local indigenous communities? So thanks for touching on that.
Yes, thank you very much, both of you. That was very helpful. I know that also I wanted to mention that Klika put some resources in the chat box if you didn't see those. Very helpful reading resources for you. I know that we had a conversation earlier as we were planning this, and I really appreciated him pointing me to some of these resources as we were talking about some wording, right? So talking about definitions and terminologies and how sometimes our terminologies are different. And I noticed that I was using different terminologies and really appreciated some of that reading material and being informed on that. And so I'm still learning and grateful for the resources and I'm grateful for your time today as well. This has been I think a great conversation. I know that we have about 6 minutes left, and this may be a big question, and I kind of thought, do I ask it or not? But I think it's really important as we look in some of these, looking through some of these presentations, is the question, you know, looking at something like you've done in Hawaii, Kuika, and also looking to what we can do here on the East Coast and knowing that there still might be some differences in mindsets and changes and maybe, you know, certainly worldview changes. What is maybe something that I know there might be some land managers, and again, hating to use that term, but for lack of a better term right now in my mindset, what can folks do to start in, you know, thinking differently? What would be a good, using even Hawaii as an example, what would be helpful for folks to be thinking about as they're looking at restoration and land, again, for lack of a better term, land management or that relationship?
Yeah, let me see you right there. So a word that we use a lot in Hawaii is stewardship. We like stewardship because that's a word that recognizes that we don't own something, but yet we are in positions to care for resources. Even resources is a word that a lot of people have a problem with, but we are in positions of stewardship, and so that's how we think about it. And I'm not sure if I have anything profound to add, but I think positionality is really important. Positionality in terms of the things around us. So we have a proverb in Hawaii, "He ali'i ka aina he ka wā ke kanaka," which means that you know, it's hard to translate things without using gender terms because Hawaiian doesn't have gender connotations like English does, but basically it means that land is king and humans are servants. And so that's basically how I see myself. I see myself as a servant of the land. And when you're a servant of the land, you have to do what it wants you to do. And so part of what I have talked about a lot. What some of the things that I've been taught by the elders I had on that first initial slide I had, and I try to convey to, you know, when I'm sharing, is that there is a way to listen to the land, and the land tells you what it needs, but you need to know how to listen to what it's saying. And that's not always listening with your ears. It's actually engaging a whole bunch of different senses that we don't even learn about in institutional education systems. But once you listen to the land, and you can help do what it wants you to do. So that's all I have to say about that. Sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you. Very profound. So thank you so much, Kyle and Kawiko. We really appreciate your time today. And I hope that this is one of many conversations that's being had about stewardship. So we really appreciate that perspective, and hopefully conversations will continue. And I know Kyle, working with local incution and local Indigenous communities in the area, that will continue, and that's my hope from this particular talk today. So I'm going to end the recording now and thank everybody, but I am going to put up a poll so that it helps us with